The wind in Dry Creek did not blow so much as it scoured. It came down from the high, jagged spine of the mountains to the north, picking up grit, dead sage, and the coal smoke from the railhead before slamming into the warped boardwalks of the town. It was the year 1878, and the territory was balancing on a knife edge between the open, lawless range and the iron order of the railroad. Dry Creek was an ugly town, built of raw lumber that had turned gray under the relentless sun before the sap had even dried. Main Street was a rutted scar of dried mud that turned to glue when the rains came, flanked by false-fronted buildings that leaned away from the prevailing gusts. The air always tasted of grit. Just south of the town proper, the railroad crews were blasting rock, a dull, rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a massive, approaching beast. The dust from the cattle pens mingled with the black smoke of the construction engines, creating a permanent haze that hung over the rooftops, turning the sunsets into bruised purples and bloody reds. 3 miles outside of town, on a patch of land that God seemed to have forgotten, Clara Mallory fought her daily war against the elements. She was 24 years old, though the wind and the sun had already etched fine lines around her eyes, giving her the look of someone who had spent a lifetime squinting against the glare. The morning began as it always did, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Clara hauled water from the thin, miserly creek that marked the boundary of their claim. The buckets were heavy, oak staves bound with iron, and the wire handle dug into calluses that had long since replaced the soft skin of her girlhood. She walked with a steady, rhythmic gait, fighting the gusts that tried to splash the precious water onto the thirsty dust. Her hands were red and chapped, the knuckles swollen. Every fence post on their 160 acres had been set by those hands, and the larger, rougher hands of her husband, Eli. She set the buckets down near the small vegetable plot, a pitiful square of green defying the endless brown of the scrubland. The wind whipped a loose strand of dark hair across her face, stinging her cheek. She tucked it back with a sharp, impatient gesture. Clara was not a woman given to self-pity. She had grown up in a shanty town near the mines, the daughter of a washerwoman who died coughing blood, and a father who vanished when the whiskey ran out. The townspeople of Dry Creek remembered that. To the shopkeepers' wives and the church ladies in their stiff bonnets, Clara was still that stubborn girl from the mud, the one who did not know her place, the one who had the audacity to marry a decent, hard-working man like Eli Mallory and pretend she was a landowner. She feared poverty the way other women feared the devil. It was a cold, hollow dread in her belly that never quite went away. That fear made her fierce. It made her cling to this scrap of hardpan earth as if it were a kingdom. Eli came out of the small sodden timber house, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was a lean man, all sinew and bone, with a face burned mahogany by the sun and eyes that held a gentle, quiet humor that the hard country had not yet extinguished. "Morning. Clara," he said, his voice raspy with sleep. He took the heavy buckets from her without asking, their fingers brushing. His skin was rough, like tree bark, but his touch was tender. He poured a little water into the basin for her to wash, then went to tend the 2 bony mules that were their livelihood. Later, they sat on the stoop sharing a tin cup of coffee. The beans were stale, stretched with chicory, but the heat of it was a comfort against the morning chill. Eli watched the horizon, where the faint green shoots of their wheat were fighting through the dry soil. "It looks good," he said softly. "If the rain holds off the rot, and the sun do not burn it, we might make enough to buy that plow come harvest." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. He smelled of hay and sweat and tobacco. "It is going to make it," she said. "We did not work this hard for the wind to take it." Eli brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek with his thumb. "You are too hard on yourself. Clara, you work like 2 men. I work like a woman who wants to keep her roof," she replied. They sat there for a moment, hands clasped, staring at the land. It was a simple, quiet intimacy, a silent acknowledgement that it was the 2 of them against a world that wanted to grind them into dust. But the world was getting closer. By mid-afternoon, the rumble of hooves announced the arrival of the trouble they had been dreading. Silas Braddock's men were riding the perimeter again. Braddock was the cattle baron of the valley, a man whose ambition was as vast as the territory. He owned the biggest herds, the sheriff, and the mayor. Now, with the railroad spur coming through, he wanted a continuous grazing route from the high pastures to the loading pens. The Mallory claim sat right in the middle of his path like a stone in a boot. 3 riders walked their horses along the fence line. They were hard men, dusted in trail grit, wearing pistols low on their hips. They laughed as they passed Clara, who was mending a section of wire. "Look at that," one of them called out, pitching his voice to carry over the wind, scratching in the dirt like a chicken. "Little people in the way of big plans," another shouted. "Shame to see a pretty woman working so hard for nothing." Clara did not look up. She twisted the wire tight, the barb biting into her leather gloves. She felt the old shame burn in her throat, the memory of being the washerwoman's daughter, but she swallowed it down. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. 2 days later, the threat escalated from insults to authority. Sheriff Burke rode out to the homestead just as the sun was setting. Burke was a man who prided himself on his appearance. Even out here in the dust, his boots were polished to a high shine, and his vest was brushed clean. He had a smooth, fleshy face and eyes that were flat and dead, like a lizard basking on a rock. He was often seen drinking whiskey in the back room of the saloon with Braddock, nodding as the cattleman spoke. Eli met him at the gate. Clara stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart hammering a warning rhythm against her ribs. "Evening." "Eli," the sheriff said, leaning casually on his saddle horn. "Sheriff." Eli nodded, keeping his hands visible but away from his sides. Burke smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Just passing through. Had a chat with Mr. Braddock today. He is a generous man. Eli, he is worried about you folks out here. It is hard country. Accidents happen. Fires start. Wells go dry. We are doing just fine." "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice steady. Burke sighed, as if Eli were a slow-witted child. "He is offering $300 for the deed." "Eli, that is more than this patch of dirt will ever grow in 10 years. You could take that money, move on west, California, maybe." Eli straightened his back. "This is our land. I filed the claim. I proved it up, and I have the deed. It is not for sale, not for 300, not for 3,000. The sheriff's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard look that made Clara's breath catch. "You are a stubborn man, Mallory. The law cannot always protect people who refuse to listen to reason." "I expect the law to protect my rights," Eli said. Burke chuckled, a dry sound like boots crunching on gravel. "The law does what it must. Son, you remember that." He turned his horse and rode off into the twilight. Clara rushed to the gate, grabbing Eli's arm. Her pride was flaring hot, but beneath it, the fear was coiling tight. "He threatened you?" she whispered. Eli put his arm around her. "He is just talking. Clara, just blowing wind for Braddock. We have the paper. They cannot touch us." But Clara watched the dust settle in the sheriff's wake, and she knew that in Dry Creek, paper meant nothing if you did not have the money to hold it down. The hammer fell 4 nights later. A railroad surveyor, a man named Holloway, who was known to take coin from Braddock to adjust property lines, was found shot dead near the newly laid tracks. He was lying face down in the dirt, a single bullet in his back. The town buzzed instantly. In the saloons and the general store, the gossip spread like wildfire. Men muttered over their beers that the homesteaders were getting desperate. They said the farmers were always trouble, holding up progress, getting violent when they could not pay their bills. Sheriff Burke did not investigate. He did not look for tracks. He did not question the drifters in town. He rode straight to the Mallory place with 4 deputies. They dragged Eli out of the field where he was working. They threw him into the dirt in front of Clara. "We found the gun," Burke announced, holding up an old Navy revolver. It had been found, he claimed, in the brush 10 yards from the body. It had Eli's initials scratched into the grip. "That is a lie," Clara screamed, rushing forward. "Eli has been here with me every night. That is not his gun." A deputy shoved her back, hard enough that she stumbled and fell. "We have a witness. Mrs. Mallory," Burke said smoothly. "A man saw your husband arguing with Holloway 2 days ago. Heard him say he would kill him if he crossed his line again. It was a setup, clumsy and brutal, but it was enough." Eli was hauled onto a horse, his hands bound behind his back. Clara ran alongside the horse for a quarter mile, clutching at Eli's leg, begging them to listen, until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She watched them drag him toward town, the dust swirling around them, swallowing her husband. The trial was a farce held in the sweltering heat of the county courthouse. The air in the room was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and old wood. The judge was a small, nervous man with watery eyes, a political appointee who owed his position to the influence of men like Silas Braddock. Burke presented the evidence with practiced theatricality. The gun, the paid witness, a drifter with shifty eyes who recited his lines while staring at the floor. The prosecutor painted Eli as a violent, desperate man, a failure who lashed out at the progress of the railroad. Clara sat in the front row, her hands gripping the wooden railing until her knuckles turned white. When the prosecutor called Eli a murderer, she stood up. "He is lying," she cried out, her voice cracking. Her desperation made her sound shrill, frantic. "You are all lying. Silas Braddock wants our land. That is what this is." The judge slammed his gavel down. "Sit down, woman, or I will have you removed." The room turned to look at her. She saw no sympathy in their faces. The shopkeepers, the miners, the cattlemen. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a hysterical woman. They saw the washerwoman's daughter making a scene. Clara heard the whispers rippling through the benches behind her. "Too bold. That one," a woman murmured, "always was too mouthy. Women should stay out of men's business." A man grunted. "Poor men get jealous and stupid when money is on the table." Another whispered. Eli sat in the dock, his shoulders slumped, looking at Clara with eyes full of sorrow. He knew. He realized before she did that the truth did not matter here. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. The execution was set for noon the following day. The town square of Dry Creek was a flat expanse of beaten earth. The gallows was a rough construction of new pine, looking stark and yellow against the blinding white of the sky. The sun beat down with a physical weight, stinging the eyes and baking the dust. The whole town came out. It was a spectacle, a break in the monotony of the frontier. Men stood with their thumbs in their belts. Women shaded their eyes with parasols. There was a low hum of conversation, an uneasy energy. Clara stood at the very front of the crowd. She did not cry. She could not. Her grief had moved beyond tears into a place of crushing pressure. Her fingers dug into the rough wooden rail that separated the crowd from the scaffold. She squeezed so hard that a splinter drove deep into her palm, and a drop of dark blood welled up. But she did not feel it. They brought Eli out. He looked small between the burly deputies. His hands were tied behind him, and he walked with a slight limp. When they led him up the stairs, the creak of the wood was the only sound in the square. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Sheriff Burke stood on the platform, looking solemn, acting the part of the reluctant servant of justice. He checked the knot. He placed the hood over Eli's head. But before he did, Eli found Clara in the crowd. His eyes locked onto hers. There was no fear in them, only a profound love and a terrible apology. He mouthed her name. Clara's breath hitched in her chest. She wanted to run to him, to tear the wood apart with her bare hands, but her legs were frozen. "Any last words?" Burke asked, his voice booming for the crowd. Eli spoke through the hood, his voice muffled but clear. "I am an innocent man. God judge you all." Burke signaled the executioner. "Eli!" Clara screamed. The sound tore out of her throat, raw and animalistic. "Eli!" The trapdoor dropped with a thunderous crack. The rope snapped tight. The body jerked violently, then swung, twisting slowly in the hot wind. The crowd let out a collective breath, a sound that was half gasp, half sigh. Then, quickly, The unease set in. They began to disperse, eyes downcast, moving away from the sight of the dead man as if his bad luck might be contagious. Clara did not move. She stood there as the square emptied, as the sun began its long slide down the sky. She watched the boots of the man she loved swinging empty in the air. She made a low, keening sound, a high-pitched vibration in her throat that she could not stop. It was the sound of a heart breaking, piece by piece. Eventually, the undertaker came. Clara fought him at first, clawing at his coat, but then the strength left her. She took the body home in the back of a borrowed wagon. That night, the shack was silent. The silence was heavier than the wind. It pressed against the walls, filled the corners, sat on her chest. Clara sat in the rocking chair, Eli's heavy wool coat in her lap. She stroked the rough fabric, smelling the lingering scent of him, tobacco, earth, and sweat. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards of the siding, a lonely, ghostly sound. She sat there for hours as the moon rose and the shadows stretched across the floor. Slowly, the grief began to change. The weeping had stopped. The keening had faded. In the hollow space where her heart used to be, something cold and hard began to crystallize. She thought of Sheriff Burke's polished boots. She thought of the way he smirked when he told Eli to sell. She thought of Silas Braddock's men laughing at her. She thought of the townspeople turning their faces away, content to let a murder happen so long as it was done legally. The law must do what it must. That is what they had said. Clara stood up. The movement was stiff, mechanical. She walked to the small wooden chest tucked under their bed. She knelt on the rough floorboards and opened the lid. Inside lay Eli's other possessions, his good Bible, his grandfather's watch, and wrapped in an oilcloth, his heavy Colt revolver. It was not the gun Burke had planted. It was the gun Eli had used to protect their wagon on the journey west. Clara unwrapped the cloth. The metal was cold and heavy in her hand. She sat at the small table and lit a kerosene lamp. The flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. With slow, shaking hands, she gathered the cleaning supplies, a rag, a tin of oil, a ramrod. She opened the loading gate and spun the cylinder. Click, click, click. She wiped the grease from the barrel. She polished the hammer. Her mind was not on the task, but on a loop of memories. The way Eli laughed, the way the trap door sounded, the way Burke's eyes looked, dead, like a lizard. No one was coming to save her. No one would speak for Eli. They had branded him a murderer and killed him to steal a strip of dried dirt. If the law was a weapon used by rich men to kill poor men, then Clara would not be bound by it. She began to load the chambers. Powder, ball, wad, grease, cap. 6 times. The shaking in her hands stopped. A terrible, trembling resolve settled over her. She was terrified. She could feel the fear vibrating in her bones, a primal instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, but the rage was stronger. It was a cold fire that burned away the tears. Clara stood up. She put on her coat, buttoning it to the chin. She shoved the heavy revolver into the waistband of her skirt, hiding it beneath the coat. She walked out into the night. It had begun to drizzle. A cold, miserable rain that turned the dust to slick mud. The wind had died down to a whisper. Clara saddled the mare, her movements efficient and sure. She mounted and turned the horse toward town. The ride was a blur. She did not feel the rain soaking her hair or the chill seeping into her bones. She saw only the destination. Dry Creek was quiet. The saloons were closing. The honest folk were in bed. The only light came from the lantern hanging outside the sheriff's office, a yellow beacon in the gray mist. Clara dismounted a block away and tied the mare to a hitching post. She patted the horse's neck once, a final goodbye to the life she had known. She walked down the center of the muddy street. The mud sucked at her boots. Her jaw was set so hard her teeth ached. She was Clara Mallory, the washerwoman's daughter, the widow of the hanged man. And she was done being powerless. She stepped onto the boardwalk, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. She reached the door of the sheriff's office. She paused for one heartbeat, her hand hovering over the latch. She took a breath that tasted of rain and coal smoke. Then, she opened the door. The kerosene lamp on Sheriff Burke's desk cast a sickly yellow pool of light against the encroaching shadows of the office. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window pane, a weeping sound that seemed to wash the color out of the world. Inside, the only sound was the rustle of paper and the heavy, satisfied breathing of a man who believed himself untouchable. Clara stood just inside the door, the water dripping from the hem of her coat to form a dark puddle on the floorboards. She felt lightheaded, as if her body were floating a few inches above her boots. Her hand was shoved deep inside her coat, gripping the cold, walnut handle of Eli's revolver. Burke did not look up immediately. He was busy. A stack of greenbacks sat on the blotter, crisp and new. The kind of money that did not circulate among the farmers and miners of Dry Creek. Beside the money lay a document with a heavy wax seal. Clara recognized the seal even from this distance. It belonged to Silas Braddock. Burke was counting the wages of his sin. 50, 100, 150, Burke muttered, wetting his thumb to turn a bill. He finally sensed her presence. He stopped, his hand hovering over the cash, and looked up. For a moment, his face registered genuine surprise, followed quickly by a smirk that made the bile rise in Clara's throat. "Well now, Mrs. Mallory," Burke said, leaning back in his chair. The wood groaned under his weight. "You should not be out in this weather. It is a long ride back to that empty shack of yours." Clara took a step forward. The floorboard creaked. "I came to ask you why," she said. Her voice was low, trembling not with fear, but with the sheer effort of keeping the scream inside her chest. "Why?" Burke chuckled. A wet, dismissive sound. He picked up a pen and twirled it between his fingers. "There is no why. Clara, just the way of things. Eli was a fool. I told him to sell. A man who cannot listen to reason is a man who invites the reaper." "He was innocent," Clara said. "You framed him. You killed him for land." Burke's smile vanished, replaced by the flat, dead look of a reptile. He stood up, placing his hands on the desk. He looked at her not as a person, but as a nuisance, a fly buzzing around his dinner. "Eli brought it on himself," Burke said, his voice dropping to a growl. "He was small in the way of big men. And you are just a hysterical widow who needs to go home before she gets into trouble she cannot handle. Now get out. Go find yourself a new husband who knows how to bend a knee when he ought to." The insult struck her like a physical blow. The memory of Eli's face as the hood came down. The love, the apology, flashed before her eyes, superimposed over Burke's arrogant sneer. Clara pulled the gun. It was heavy, dragging her arm down, but she leveled it at his chest. The barrel wavered, describing a small, erratic circle in the air. Burke froze. His eyes widened, flicking from the dark muzzle of the Colt to Clara's face. Then he laughed. It was a nervous, incredulous laugh. "Put that away, girl," he said, moving his right hand slowly toward his hip. "You do not have the sand to pull that trigger. You are shaking like a leaf. Do not touch your gun," Clara whispered. Burke sneered. "Go home, Clara, before I have to—" He moved. His hand dropped to his holster with the speed of a man who had used his weapon to intimidate 100 times before. Clara did not think. She did not aim. She simply squeezed her hand shut. The explosion was deafening in the small room. It was not a pop, but a roar that slapped against the walls and shattered the air. The muzzle flash blinded her for a split second. Through the smoke, she saw Burke jerk backward as if kicked by a mule. He slammed into the metal filing cabinet behind him, the impact rattling the drawers, before sliding down to the floor. A dark, wet stain was already blossoming on the white of his shirt, right over his heart. He looked at her, his mouth opening and closing silently, his eyes full of shock and a sudden, terrible understanding. Then his head lolled to the side, and he was still. Clara stood frozen. The gun smoke drifted up into the lamplight, acrid and biting. Her ears were ringing. She stared at the man who had murdered her husband. Now, a heap of cooling meat on the floor. She expected to feel triumph. She expected to feel righteous. Instead, she felt a hollow, terrifying coldness. She had just killed a man. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The sound of shouting rose from the street outside. The gunshot had been heard. "They are coming," she whispered to herself. She looked at the desk. The money was scattered. The document with Braddock's seal lay open. Instinct took over. A frantic, animal need to grab something. Anything that proved she was not crazy, that this was not senseless. She shoved the gun back into her belt and grabbed the stack of papers from the desk. Deeds, letters, the survey maps. She crumpled them into a ball and shoved them into the deep pocket of her coat. She turned and ran. Clara burst out of the office door just as a figure rounded the corner from the saloon. It was a deputy, a young man named Miller, who had held Eli's horse while they tied him up. "Hey!" Miller shouted, seeing her running silhouette. "Stop!" Clara did not stop. She scrambled down the boardwalk steps into the mud. Miller drew his weapon and fired. The bullet whistled past her ear, slapping into the wood of the sheriff's office with a dull thud. Clara ducked into the narrow alley between the general store and the livery stable. It was pitch black, smelling of wet hay and manure. She stumbled over a discarded crate, scraping her shin, but the pain felt distant. She reached the back of the stable where she had tied the mare. The horse was tossing its head, spooked by the gunshot. Clara fumbled with the knot, her fingers slick with rain and sweat. Come on," she hissed. The knot gave way. She dragged the mare to a mounting block and hauled herself into the saddle. She kicked the horse's flanks hard. They burst out of the alley and into the open scrub behind the town. Shouts were echoing down Main Street now, lanterns bobbing in the darkness like angry fireflies. Clara did not look back. She leaned low over the mare's neck, guiding her toward the open darkness of the range. The rain began to harden, turning into sleet that stung her face like thrown gravel. She pushed the horse into a gallop, the hoofbeats swallowed by the mud and the wind. Behind her, the faint glow of Dry Creek faded until it was nothing but a smudge of yellow against the black night. She was alone in the void. The landscape, once her home, turned into a hostile stranger. The hills were jagged silhouettes that seemed to lean in, blocking the sky. The washes, usually dry, were running with thick, brown sludge that threatened to trap the mare's legs. The wind cut through her thin wool coat as if it were made of lace. Clara's teeth began to chatter, a violent rattling she could not control. She unwrapped the bundle tied behind her saddle and pulled Eli's heavy coat free, struggling to put it on over her own while the horse kept moving. It smelled of him. For a second, the scent of tobacco and earth broke through the terror, and she let out a sob that was torn away by the wind. She buttoned it tight, wrapping herself in the ghost of her husband, and rode on into the freezing dark. 2 hours later, in the warm, dry parlor of the mayor's house, Silas Braddock stood by the fireplace, warming his hands. He was a large man, built like a bull, with a thick neck and hands that could crush a walnut. Judge Holloway sat in a plush armchair, nursing a glass of brandy. His face was pale. "Dead," Braddock said, staring into the flames. "Shot in his own office by a woman. It is embarrassing. Judge, she is a wildcat," the judge muttered, his hands shaking as he lifted the glass. "I told you we should have run her off the day after the hanging, and missed the chance to make an example." Braddock turned, his eyes hard. "This changes nothing. In fact, it simplifies things. Before, she was a grieving widow. People might have felt sorry for her. Now, she is a cop killer, a murderess. We have to catch her," the judge said. "The town is in an uproar." "We will catch her," Braddock said, "but I do not want the local boys fumbling around in the hills. She grew up here. She knows the land better than those drunk deputies. We need a professional, someone who does not care about sob stories." He walked to the writing desk and pulled out a telegraph form. "I know a man," Braddock said. the pen scratching loudly across the paper. He works out of the railhead in Abilene. He is expensive, but he never comes back empty-handed. Jack Rourke rode into the rail town of Junction City 3 days later. The town was a chaotic, sprawling mess of tents and raw lumber, existing solely to serve the railhead pushing west. It smelled of coal smoke, unwashed men, and desperate commerce. Jack was a man who seemed to carry his own silence with him. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a duster stained with the dust of 3 territories. His face was a map of hard years, lines etched deep around his eyes, a scar running through his left eyebrow, and a beard kept short and practical. He rode a tall bay gelding that looked as road-weary as he did. He tied his horse outside the telegraph office and stepped inside. The air was dry and smelled of ink. The clerk, a bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers, looked up. "Telegram for Rourke," Jack said. His voice was gravel, low and unused to casual conversation. The clerk rummaged in a slot and slid a yellow envelope across the counter. Jack opened it with a calloused thumb. He read the message twice, his face betraying nothing. Then he looked at the wanted poster the clerk had just pinned to the board behind him. "Wanted for murder, Clara Mallory. Reward, $500. Jack studied the sketch. It was a crude likeness, but it showed a woman with high cheekbones and intense eyes. $500, Jack murmured. "That is a lot of coin for a woman." "She shot a sheriff," the clerk said, eager to gossip. "Put a hole right through his heart. They say she is a cold one, mad as a hatter, killed him in cold blood while he was doing his paperwork." Jack looked at the poster again. Beneath the name, in smaller print, it read, "Widow of Eli Mallory, recently hanged for murder." The details snagged in his mind like a burr. A widow, shooting the man who likely hanged her husband. He walked out of the office and headed for the nearest saloon. He needed a drink to wash the trail dust from his throat. The saloon was crowded, loud, and smoky. Jack found a spot at the end of the bar. He ordered a whiskey and listened. A bounty hunter's best tool was not his gun, but his ears. "You hear about that business down in Dry Creek?" A man 2 stools down was saying to his companion. "Yeah, crazy business. They say she'd walked right in and blasted him." "Good riddance, if you ask me," the companion muttered into his beer. "Burke was crooked as a dog's hind leg. And that hanging? I was there delivering supplies. Never saw a trial go that fast. 10 minutes of talking and then the rope." "Hush up," the first man said, looking around. "Braddock has ears everywhere." Jack sipped his whiskey. The burn was familiar and grounding. So, the sheriff was crooked, and the hanging was rushed. That explained the widow's anger. It did not change the job, though. A warrant was a warrant. The law was the brittle skeleton holding this wild country together. If you broke it, you paid. He fingered the last few coins in his pocket. He was down to his last $4. His horse needed shoes. He needed ammunition. He could not afford to have a conscience about the tragic backstory of his targets. He finished the drink in one swallow and set the glass down with a sharp clack. "I will take the job," he said to the empty air. Clara had found the line shack by accident. It was tucked into a fold of the foothills, 20 miles north of Dry Creek. It had been abandoned for years. The roof had collapsed in one corner, and the door hung on a single leather hinge. It was barely shelter, but it was out of the wind. Inside, Clara huddled in the corner. She had managed to gather some dead sagebrush and a few damp logs. Her hands were numb, the fingers stiff and clumsy as she struck a lucifer match. The flame flared blue and orange, a tiny miracle in the gloom. She cupped her hands around it, feeding it dry grass until the fire caught. Smoke filled the small space, stinging her eyes, but the warmth was worth it. She held her hands so close to the flames that the skin turned red. She was hungry. Her stomach was a knotted fist of pain. She had eaten nothing but a handful of dried berries she found on a bush near the creek. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the ball of crumpled papers she had taken from Burke's desk. She smoothed them out on her knee. Squinting in the dim firelight, there were deeds. Deeds to the Miller farm, the Henderson place, and the creek access for the Lazy J Ranch, all signed over to Silas Braddock for pittance sums. Then she found the letter. It was addressed to Burke, written in a sprawling, arrogant hand. Burke, the railroad surveyor will be in town on Tuesday. Ensure he finds problems with the Mallory boundary. If Eli Mallory refuses to sell, apply the necessary pressure. The rail spur must go through that valley. I do not care how you clear the obstruction. Just clear it. S. Braddock. Clara stared at the words. The letters seemed to swim before her eyes. Ensure he finds problems. Apply pressure. Clear the obstruction. Eli was the obstruction. A sob broke from her chest, a ragged, tearing sound. She rocked back and forth, clutching the letter to her chest. "I'm sorry. Eli," she whispered to the empty shack. "I'm so sorry. I did not know. I thought it was just greed. I did not know they planned it all along." She looked at the fire. She felt a strange duality within her. Part of her was the terrified young woman who had watched her husband die. But another part, a new and frightening part, was the woman who had pulled the trigger in that office. She remembered the kick of the gun, the way Burke fell, and she realized with a jolt of horror that she did not regret it. She only regretted that Braddock had not been standing next to him. "I am going insane," she thought. "The silence is eating me. Talk to me. Eli," she begged. "Please, just tell me what to do." But the wind only howled through the gaps in the logs, and the fire popped and hissed. She was alone with the evidence of a conspiracy she could not prove and a crime she could not deny. Jack Rourke arrived in Dry Creek 2 days later. He did not announce himself. He rode in quietly, tied his horse, and began to work. He visited the sheriff's office first. The bloodstain was still on the floor, dried to a rust color. He noted the angle of the shot, the position of the filing cabinet. She had been close. It wasn't a sniper's shot. It was a confrontation. He walked the town. He spoke to the blacksmith, the livery owner, the women hanging laundry. She was a stubborn one, the blacksmith said, hammering a glowing horseshoe, always had a look in her eye like she was better than her station. But killing? I never figured her for a killer. The livery owner was less guarded. Burke was a snake. Everyone knew it. And that hanging, well, let us just say Eli Mallory was a good man who had bad luck with his neighbors. Jack went to the general store. The owner, an old man with spectacles thick as bottle bottoms, hesitated before speaking. "She came in here sometimes," the old man said softly. "Bought flour, coffee. She counted every penny. But she was kind. Once. She helped my wife lift a heavy sack when my back was out. She did not seem like a monster. Mister, she seemed like a woman who was scared." Jack walked out into the sunlight, tipping his hat. The picture was forming, and he did not like it. The official story, the cold-blooded cop killer, was fraying at the edges. He saw a desperate woman pushed into a corner, but sympathy did not pay for horseshoes. He rode out to the Mallory place. The house was empty, the door swinging open. Looters had already been there. The furniture was overturned, the meager possessions gone. He found the tracks behind the barn. They were old, washed out by the rain. But Jack could read the ground like a primer. He saw where the mare had stood. He saw the frantic, deep hoofprints of the escape. He followed them. He tracked her north, into the broken country. He found where she had stopped to rest the horse. He found a place where she had tried to build a fire and failed, leaving behind charred twigs. "She is an amateur," he thought. "She is making mistakes. She is panicking." As he rode, following the faint signs, a broken sage branch, a scuff on a rock, he began to visualize her. Not the face on the poster, but the woman. He imagined her cold. He imagined her fear. "Stop it," he told himself. "She is the target. You are the hunter. Do not mix them up." The weather turned on the third day of the hunt. The sky to the west turned a bruised purple, then a sickly yellow. The wind died suddenly, creating a vacuum of silence that made the hair on Jack's arms stand up. "Dust storm," he muttered. He pulled his kerchief up over his nose and pulled his hat brim low. He checked his canteen. He checked his horse. Most men would hole up, wait it out. But Jack possessed an obsessive drive, a relic of the war when stopping meant death. He pressed on. Miles ahead, Clara saw the wall of dust approaching. It looked like a mountain range moving across the plains, swallowing the world. She tried to outrun it, but the mare was exhausted. The wall hit them with the force of a physical blow. The light vanished. The air turned to sandpaper. Sand lashed her face, stinging like 1,000 bees. It filled her nose, her mouth. The horse panicked, rearing up. Clara slid from the saddle, hitting the ground hard. She kept her grip on the reins, screaming at the horse to calm down. But the wind tore the words away. She wrapped her scarf around her face, blinding herself. She stumbled forward, leading the horse, her head down. She could not see 5 feet in front of her. The world was nothing but brown noise and pain. She walked until her legs were lead. She walked until she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She tumbled, sliding down a steep, rocky embankment into a ravine. The horse skittered down behind her. Clara hit the bottom, the breath knocked out of her. She lay there, curled in a ball, while the storm roared overhead like a passing train. Jack rode through the storm's fury. His eyes narrowed to slits. He trusted his horse to find footing. He trusted his instinct to keep the direction. When the wind finally began to die down, hours later, the world was changed. Drifts of sand lay against every rock and bush. The air was still thick with dust, hanging like a fog. Jack dismounted. He walked a wide circle, scanning the ground. The storm had wiped out the tracks. But then he saw it, caught on the thorns of a mesquite bush near the edge of a ravine, a scrap of blue wool. He walked over and plucked it free. It was from a coat, a man's coat, heavy and rough, but the tear was fresh. He looked down into the ravine, faint. Dragged lines in the sand led downward. Jack Rourke looked at the scrap of fabric in his hand, then at the mountains rising in the distance. The trail was hot again. He swung back into the saddle. He pushed down the thought of the woman freezing in that ravine. He pushed down the doubt about the hanging. He focused on the only things that mattered in his trade: irons, rope, reward. He spurred his horse forward. The hunt was tightening. The cabin appeared like a gray hallucination out of the sleet. It was tucked high in a fold of the granite peaks, a structure built of rough-hewn lodgepole pine that had weathered to the color of old bone. The roof was a patchwork of split shakes and sod, sagging dangerously in the middle, and the door hung askew on leather hinges that had long since dried and cracked. To Clara Mallory, shivering so violently she could barely keep her seat in the saddle, it looked like a palace. She had been riding for 5 days since the storm in the lowlands. The journey had stripped the flesh from her face, leaving her gaunt and hollow-eyed. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her hands wrapped in rags to ward off the frostbite that gnawed at her fingertips. The mare was in no better shape, its ribs showing through a coat matted with mud and ice. Clara slid from the saddle, her legs buckling as her feet hit the frozen ground. She caught herself on the horse's flank, gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. She led the mare into a lean-to built against the side of the cabin, offering it the last handful of oats from her saddlebag. "I will get you water soon," she whispered, her voice a rasp that sounded like dry leaves dragging on stone. Inside, the cabin smelled of rodent droppings, pine resin, and the sour, ancient smoke of 1,000 fires. It had been abandoned by trappers for seasons, left to the mice and the wind. A rusted iron stove sat in the corner, a blackened pipe jutting up through the roof. A stack of dry wood, miraculously untouched by the damp, lay against the wall. Clara moved with the jerky, desperate coordination of the starving. She crumpled dry moss into the stove's belly and struck a match. Her fingers were so stiff she dropped the first 2, cursing softly as they fizzled in the dirt. The third caught. The flame licked up the moss, catching the kindling. When the heat finally began to radiate from the iron, Clara collapsed onto the floor in front of it. She pulled a pile of moth-eaten blankets from a low bunk and wrapped them around her shoulders. They smelled of unwashed men and old grease, but she buried her face in them, weeping without tears. She lay there for a long time, the fire popping and hissing. "Eli," she whispered into the gloom. "I am still running. I do not know where I am going. I just keep moving up." She closed her eyes, and exhaustion pulled her under. But sleep was not a refuge. It was a theater for her terror. She saw the town square of Dry Creek, bleached white by the sun. She saw the rope tighten. She saw Eli's boots kicking at the air, dancing a terrible jig. Then the scene shifted. She was back in the sheriff's office, the gun jumping in her hand, the deafening roar, Burke's head snapping back, the blood black and shiny in the lamplight. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her cheeks were wet. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow across the floor. The wind was howling outside, battering the cabin walls, screaming like a living thing that wanted to get in. 2,000 feet below, Jack Rourke was pushing his way up a scree slope that would have broken a lesser man. The trail had turned brutal. The scrubland had given way to jagged rock and thin, twisted pines that clung to the mountain face with desperate roots. The air here was thin and sharp, biting deep into the lungs with every breath. Jack rode with his chin tucked into his collar. He had been tracking Clara Mallory for a week now. She was good at hiding, better than he had expected, but she was an amateur at covering her tracks. She left signs that a woman used to the wilderness would have erased. A broken branch here, a scuff of a boot heel there. He stopped at a small mountain stream that cut through the gray rock like a scar. The water was crystalline and freezing. He dismounted to let his gelding drink and knelt to fill his own canteen. Something caught his eye on the bank, a flat stone, smooth and dry, where someone had knelt recently. He leaned closer. In the mud beside the stone, there was a faint, milky residue. He touched it with his finger and brought it to his nose. Soap, lavender and lye. Jack sat back on his heels, the scent confusing his senses. In this harsh gray world of rock and ice, the smell was shockingly domestic. He looked at the stream, and the image came to him unbidden. The woman, hunted and desperate, breaking the ice on the water to wash her face. He imagined her cupping the freezing water to her cheeks, scrubbing at the grime of the trail, trying to wash away the dust and the guilt. It unsettled him. He was used to tracking men who smelled of whiskey and fear. This faint trace of lavender made her real. It made her a woman, not just a quarry. "Do not do that," he told himself, splashing water on his face to clear the thought. She is $500. She is a job. He remounted and pressed on. The sky was darkening, the clouds heavy and gray, hanging low over the peaks like a bruised ceiling. The temperature was plummeting. By late afternoon, the snow began. It was not a gentle drift, but a sudden, violent assault. The wind picked up, driving the flakes sideways. The world turned white and featureless in minutes. Jack urged his horse up a narrow switchback. The path was barely 3 feet wide, a ledge carved into the cliff face with a sheer drop of 500 feet to the right. The snow slicked the rock instantly. His horse, a sure-footed beast usually, stepped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. Its rear legs slid out. The animal panicked, scrambling for purchase, its hooves striking sparks from the stone. "Easy," Jack roared, throwing his weight forward to balance the animal. The horse lurched, its hindquarters swinging dangerously over the void. Jack kicked his feet free of the stirrups and bailed out, hitting the rocky path hard on his shoulder. He grabbed the bridle with his good arm, digging his heels into the gravel, anchoring the terrified animal with his own body weight. "Steady," he gritted out. The horse found purchase, heaving itself back onto the solid rock, trembling violently. Jack lay in the snow for a moment, staring up at the swirling white sky. A sharp, hot pain radiated from his right shoulder. He tried to move his arm and gasped. It wasn't broken, but it was wrenched bad. He forced himself to stand. He checked the horse's legs. The animal was spooked but unhurt. Jack gritted his teeth, the pain in his shoulder throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He could not ride. The path was too dangerous now. He grabbed the reins with his left hand. "Walk," he commanded. He staggered on, leading the horse through the blinding white, his right arm hanging uselessly at his side. He was freezing, injured, and walking into the teeth of a blizzard. But he did not stop. He had a job to do. For 2 days, the storm raged. Clara was a prisoner in the cabin. The snow piled up against the door, sealing the cracks but also burying the world. The wind did not stop. It roared and shrieked, tearing at the loose shingles on the roof. She rationed her food, a strip of dried beef and a handful of coffee beans she chewed for the caffeine. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. But worse than the hunger was the silence inside the noise. She paced the small room, 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. The isolation pressed in on her. She began to feel the edges of her mind fraying. She talked to the walls. She talked to the stove. They are going to come, she said to a knot in the wood floor. They are going to bring the rope. She imagined she heard voices in the wind. Sheriff Burke laughing, Eli calling her name. She would rush to the window, scraping away the frost, only to see the endless, swirling white. Am I going mad? She wondered. Is this what it is to be a murderess? You just go mad in the dark. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died. The silence that followed was deafening. The sun broke through the clouds, brilliant and blinding, reflecting off the fresh snow. Jack Rourke, half frozen and delirious with pain, crested the ridge. He blinked against the glare. His coat was stiff with ice. His beard was a mask of frost. His shoulder was a knot of agony that had settled into a dull, thumping rhythm. Below him, in a small clearing, he saw it, a thin wisp of gray smoke rising straight up into the still air. He stared at it, swaying on his feet. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. He tied his horse to a tree 100 yards out. He checked his revolver with his left hand. An awkward, clumsy motion. He drew the weapon. He moved toward the cabin. Every step crunched loudly on the crusted snow. The sound was like a gunshot in the pristine silence. Inside, Clara froze. She was adding a log to the fire when she heard it. Crunch, crunch. It was not the wind. It was not a falling branch. It was the heavy, rhythmic tread of a man. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. She dropped the log. She scrambled for the table where she had laid Eli's colt. Her hands shook so violently she nearly knocked the gun onto the floor. She gripped the handle, the heavy steel shaking in her grip. She moved to the side of the door, pressing her back against the rough logs. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. Crunch, crunch. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Clara thumbed back the hammer. The click sounded like thunder. The latch lifted. The door, swollen with damp, groaned as it was shoved open. Jack stepped into the doorway, his silhouette dark against the blinding snow. He held his gun in his left hand, his right arm tucked into his coat. He looked like a revenant, a dead man walking, covered in ice and exhaustion. For a split second, time suspended. Jack saw her. He saw a woman who looked nothing like a killer. She was small, wrapped in oversized, filthy blankets. Her hair a wild tangle, but her eyes were wide, feral, and terrified. Clara saw him. She saw a large, looming shape. She saw the glint of a gun. She saw the law coming to finish what it started. "Drop it!" Jack croaked, his voice ruined by the cold. Clara screamed, a wordless cry of defiance, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand. The shot went wide, splintering the door frame inches from Jack's head. A sliver of wood sliced his cheek, and the bullet grazed the heavy wool of his sleeve, burning the skin of his arm. Jack reacted on instinct. He did not fire back. He dove to the right, crashing into the room. He hit the floor hard, rolling onto his bad shoulder. A white-hot bolt of pain blinded him, and he roared. Clara was trying to cock the gun again, but her thumb slipped on the hammer. She swung the heavy barrel toward him as he scrambled up. Jack lunged. He slammed into her, driving her back against the rough-hewn table. The table skidded, screeching across the floor. "Get off me!" she shrieked, striking at him with her free hand. She clawed at his face, her nails digging into his frozen skin. Jack caught her wrist, the one holding the gun. He pinned it to the table. She was strong, fueled by a hysterical, desperate strength. She kicked at his shins, her body thrashing. "Stop it!" Jack shouted, gritting his teeth against the pain in his shoulder. "Stop it! Damn you!" She swung a piece of firewood from the pile with her left hand, bringing it down on his back. It was a glancing blow, but it staggered him. They wrestled, a clumsy, violent dance in the confined space. They fell together, crashing onto the dusty floorboards. Jack landed on top of her, his weight pinning her down. He used his good arm to wrench the gun from her fingers. He tossed it across the room where it skidded under the bunk. Clara continued to fight. She bucked and twisted, her breath coming in sobbing gasps. Jack pressed his forearm across her chest, not to crush, but to hold. "Enough," he yelled, his face inches from hers. Suddenly, the fight went out of her. She went limp beneath him, staring up with eyes that were swimming with tears. They lay there for a moment, panting. The silence of the cabin rushed back in, heavy and thick. The physical intimacy of the struggle hung in the air, shocking and raw. Clara could feel the heat radiating from his heavy coat. She could smell the sweat of his exertion, the wet wool, the faint metallic tang of blood from his cheek. She could feel his heart hammering against her own chest, a frantic rhythm that matched hers. Jack looked down at her. He saw the pulse fluttering in her throat. He saw the grime on her skin, the hollows of her cheeks. He felt the fragile cage of her ribs beneath his arm. This was not a target. This was a woman. A terrified, starving woman. He realized his face was dangerously close to hers. He could feel her breath on his skin. He jerked back as if burned, scrambling to his knees and then to his feet. He backed away, scooping up her gun and shoving it into his belt. He stood leaning against the wall, cradling his injured arm, breathing hard. "I am not here to kill you, Mrs. Mallory," he said, his voice rough. "If I wanted you dead, you would not have heard me coming." Clara sat up slowly, pulling the blankets back around her. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She looked small on the floor, defeated. "You are a bounty hunter." She spat. The words were venomous, but her voice cracked. "You are just another man looking for a payday. You want to drag me back to Braddock so he can hang me like he hanged Eli?" Jack looked at her. He saw the red rims of her eyes. He saw the grief that was etched into her face deeper than the hunger. "I am bringing you in to face the law," Jack said. "Not Braddock. The law? The law?" Clara let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "There is no law. There's only Braddock's money. That is all there is. And you are just his dog?" Jack flinched. The insult landed. He looked at the woman, trembling, fierce, broken, and he felt a sudden, deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with the snow. "The storm is not done," Jack said, glancing at the window where the sky was darkening again. "We are trapped here until it clears." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of rawhide cord. "Put your hands out." Clara glared at him, but she held out her wrists. Jack tied them, his movements efficient but careful. He noticed the skin of her wrists was raw and chafed, bruises blooming purple and yellow. She had been hurting herself, probably struggling with firewood or the horse. He hesitated. He looked at the bruises, then at her face. He tied the knot, but he left it loose, just enough to hold, not enough to bite. "Sit by the fire," he said. "Do not make me tie you to the post." The hours stretched out, long and cold. The wind picked up again, rattling the door. Jack sat on the only chair, nursing his shoulder. He had found some dried beans in his saddlebag and boiled them on the stove. He offered the tin plate to Clara. She looked at it suspiciously, then took it. She ate ravenously, her hands shaking. Jack watched her in the lantern light. The flame cast long shadows that danced on the walls. "Why did you do it?" Jack asked quietly. Clara stopped eating. She stared into the fire. He smirked. She whispered, "What, Sheriff Burke?" He smirked. "He sat there counting Braddock's money, and he told me Eli deserved it. He told me Eli was a fool for not selling." She looked up at Jack, her eyes burning. "Eli did not have a gun that night. He was home with me. Burke planted it. He brought a witness who lied. The judge knew it. Everyone knew it. But they hanged him anyway because Braddock wanted our creek for his cows. She took a breath, her voice rising. I went there to ask him why. I just wanted to know why they had to kill him. Why couldn't they just take the land? And he laughed at me. He reached for his gun. She looked down at her bound hands. I did not mean to go there to kill him. But when he touched his pistol, I stopped being me. Jack listened, his face unreadable in the shadows. He wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to tell her she was lying, but the story had the ring of truth. It fit the pattern he knew too well. He remembered the war. He remembered a colonel who had sent a unit of fresh boys into a ravine to draw fire, knowing they would be slaughtered, just so he could flank a position that didn't matter. He remembered the letters of condolence that lied about bravery and purpose. He remembered the way power worked. It rolled over the weak. And then it wrote the report to say the weak had thrown themselves under the wheels. He was Braddock's man. Jack said, Burke. He was Braddock's creature, Clara corrected. Jack shifted, the pain in his shoulder flaring. He looked at Clara. She wasn't the villain the poster described. She was a casualty. I believe you, he said. The words hung in the air. Clara looked at him, stunned. You do? Jack nodded slowly. I have seen men like Braddock before. They build their empires on bones. Clara stared at him, her composure, held together by rage and terror for so long, suddenly shattered. Her chin trembled. A sob escaped her throat. Then another. She bent forward, her forehead resting on her knees, and her shoulders began to shake with silent, racking grief. Jack watched her, feeling a tightness in his own chest. He was a man who avoided emotion. He lived in a world of hard facts and cold trails. But seeing this woman break apart in front of him tore at something he thought he had buried. He stood up, instinctively, almost against his will. He crossed the small space between them. He reached out a hand, hovering over her shoulder. Then he settled it there. His hand was large, heavy, and warm. Clara flinched at the touch, tensing up. Then, as the warmth seeped through the blanket, she melted. She leaned into his hand. She turned her face toward him, looking up through her tears. Jack knelt down. He did not know why. He just knew he could not stand above her while she wept. Clara leaned forward. Her forehead touched his good shoulder. She wept into his heavy coat, the sound muffled and raw. Jack froze. He should push her away. He should check her bonds, but he didn't. He raised his hand and awkwardly patted her back. It is all right, he murmured. The words felt foreign in his mouth. Clara lifted her head. Their faces were inches apart. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the gray in his beard, the scar that cut through his brow. She saw a man who was tired of hunting. Jack saw the tear tracking through the dirt on her cheek. He saw the pulse in her neck. He smelled the faint, lingering scent of lavender soap beneath the smoke and fear. For a moment, the cabin fell away. The law fell away. There was just the storm outside and the two of them inside, the air between them charged with a sudden, electric tension. It was not just comfort. It was recognition. Two lonely, scarred people finding a moment of warmth in a cold world. Clara leaned in slightly. Jack felt her breath on his neck. His heart hammered a warning, but his body leaned toward her. Then, reality crashed back in. Jack pulled back abruptly, scrambling to his feet. He backed away to the window, staring out at the blackness of the night. His breath was coming fast. I have to check the horses. He lied. The horses were in the lean-to. He could not check them without going out into the storm. He turned back to her, his face hardening into a mask of professional distance. I still have to take you in. Clara, the warrant stands. I cannot change the law. Clara wiped her face. Her eyes hardened again, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of steel. But as she looked at him, there was something else there too. A question, a curiosity. I know, she said softly. You have a job. Jack did not answer. He moved to the other side of the room, laying his bedroll out as far from her as he could. He blew out the lantern. The darkness was complete, save for the dying glow of the stove. Jack lay on his back, staring at the invisible ceiling. His shoulder throbbed. But it was the memory of her weight against him, the smell of her hair, that kept him awake. Across the room, Clara lay still. She could hear his breathing. She could feel his presence like a gravitational pull. She was afraid of the morning. She was afraid of the rope. But for the first time in months, she was not alone in the dark, and that frightened her more than anything. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the granite peaks wrapped in a silence so profound it felt heavy on the eardrums. The world had been scrubbed clean and painted in blinding white. The sky was a hard, polished blue, the kind that offered light but no warmth. Jack Rourke stood outside the cabin, cinching the saddle onto his gelding. His movements were stiff and measured. His right shoulder was a knot of blue-black bruising and deep, throbbing ache, screaming in protest every time he lifted his arm. He grit his teeth, forcing the leather strap tight with his good hand and the leverage of his body weight. Inside, Clara Mallory was wrapping her feet in fresh strips of cloth torn from the hem of her skirt. She pulled her boots on, wincing as the stiff leather bit into her chilblains. She looked at the empty cabin one last time, the cold stove, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, the place where she had almost killed a man and then wept on his shoulder. She walked out into the snow. The glare was instant and painful. "We have to move," Jack said, not looking at her. "The snow will hide our tracks for a few miles, but if we stay, we die." He helped her onto the mare. The contact was brief, his hand gripping her elbow to boost her up. She felt the strength in his fingers, impersonal and professional. Yet she remembered the weight of his hand on her back the night before. She said nothing. They began the descent. The trail was a treacherous ribbon of white carved into the side of the mountain. The snow hid the loose shale and patches of slick ice that lay beneath. They rode in single file, Jack leading, his eyes scanning the ridgelines for movement. The air was so cold it crystallized in the nose. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the occasional slide of snow dumping from a pine branch. An hour down the slope, the trail narrowed around a sharp limestone outcrop. The drop to the left was sheer, 1,000 feet of empty air falling away to the tree line below. Clara's mare was tired. The animal placed a hoof on a flat rock that looked solid but was coated in a sheet of transparent verglas. The hoof skated outward. The mare scrambled, legs flailing, hindquarters swinging dangerously over the edge. Clara let out a sharp cry, grabbing the saddle horn as the world tilted. The horse's panic was contagious. It scrabbled for purchase, sending a shower of rocks clattering into the void. Jack reacted before the sound of her cry had faded. He spun his gelding, ignoring the pain that tore through his shoulder, and launched himself from his saddle. He landed hard on the icy trail and lunged for Clara. His boots found purchase in the snow. His good arm clamped around her waist, dragging her from the saddle just as the mare's rear leg slipped entirely over the lip. "Jump!" Jack roared. He hauled her backward, slamming her against the rock wall of the cliff face. The mare, relieved of the weight, managed a frantic, heaving lunge and scrambled back onto solid ground. Trembling and blowing hard, Clara was pressed flat against the stone, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. Jack was pressed against her, his body acting as a barrier between her and the drop. His arm was still wrapped tight around her waist, pinning her to the safety of the wall. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. Clara could feel the heat of him through their coats. She could feel the rapid, heavy thud of his heart against her shoulder. His face was inches from hers, his eyes wide and alert, scanning her face for injury. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. Clara shook her head, unable to speak. She was acutely aware of his strength. He was holding her with a ferocity that belied his injury, a protective instinct that felt less like a jailer and more like a guardian. He was not holding her to keep her captive. He was holding her to keep her alive. Jack realized the intimacy of their position. He felt the curve of her waist, the frantic rise and fall of her chest. He looked into her eyes and saw the raw fear, but also a sudden, startled recognition. He pulled back slowly, his hand lingering on her coat for a fraction of a second before dropping to his side. He winced, clutching his bad shoulder. "Walk the horse until we clear the ice," he said, turning away to hide the pain in his face. "And watch your step." They made camp that night in a shallow ravine, miles below the snow line where the pines gave way to scrub oak and sage. The air was still biting cold, damp and penetrating. Jack built a small fire in the shelter of a cut bank, keeping the flames low to avoid being seen. He tied Clara's hands, but he used a long lead, tethering her to a heavy log so she could move freely around the fire. He sat opposite her, chewing on a piece of hardtack. The silence between them was different tonight. It was not the hostile silence of the hunter and the hunted. It was the companionable, exhausted silence of two people who had survived a brush with death. The temperature dropped as the moon rose. It was a brutal, bone-deep cold that made the teeth ache. Clara huddled in her thin coat, shivering uncontrollably. Her teeth began to chatter, a sharp, clicking sound in the quiet night. Jack watched her. He saw the blue tint of her lips. He looked at his own heavy wool blanket, then at hers, which was little more than a rag. He swore softly under his breath. "Come here," he said. Clara looked up, wary. "What? You are freezing. If you get sick, you slow me down. Come here." She hesitated, then moved closer to where he sat. Jack unrolled his bedroll and gestured for her to sit beside him. When she did, he threw the heavy wool blanket over both of their shoulders, creating a cocoon against the fire. The contact was awkward at first. They sat stiffly, shoulders touching, thighs pressing against each other through the denim and wool, but the warmth was undeniable. Clara felt his body heat seeping into her frozen side, a luxury she had not felt in weeks. She hated needing him. He was the man taking her to the gallows. Yet, as the shivering subsided, she felt a traitorous sense of safety. Jack stared into the fire. He was conscious of every inch of her that touched him. He could smell the wood smoke in her hair. "You said you saw men framed before," Clara said softly, breaking the silence. "In the war?" Jack nodded slowly. He broke a twig and tossed it into the flames. "I was a scout for the Union. We had a colonel who liked headlines. He would send boys into bad spots, places he knew were traps, just so he could write a report about heroic sacrifices." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Once, we had a sergeant who refused an order he knew was suicide. The colonel had him arrested for cowardice, said he was conspiring with the enemy. They hanged him in the morning while the colonel ate breakfast. It was legal, it was efficient, and it was a lie." Clara looked at his profile, lit by the flickering orange light. He looked older than his years, a man eroded by what he had seen. "So, she said, you know the law is just a story men with power tell." "I know the law is the only thing that keeps us from being animals," Jack countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Even if it is broken, it is all we have." Clara shifted, reaching into her coat pocket with her bound hands. She pulled out the crumpled, water-stained wad of papers she had taken from Burke's desk. She handed them to him. "Read it," she said. "If you are going to trade my life for $500, you should know what you are selling." Jack took the papers. He smoothed them out on his knee, squinting in the firelight. He read the deeds first. He saw the pattern immediately. Small homesteads, crucial water rights, all transferred to Silas Braddock for sums that were insulting. He saw the signatures, shaky X marks from men who couldn't write. Witnessing by Sheriff Burke. Then he read the letter. The order to apply pressure. The command to clear the obstruction. Jack was not a lawyer, but he knew business, and he knew fraud. This wasn't just a land dispute. It was a systematic dismantling of a community, endorsed by the badge. He looked up at Clara. She was watching him, her face pale and defiant. "He killed him for a right-of-way," Jack murmured. "He killed him because Eli said no." Clara said, "And he was going to kill me too. That is why I went to the office. I knew I was next." Jack looked back at the papers. His gut twisted. He had told himself this was a simple job. Capture the killer, collect the bounty. But the paper in his hand was proof that he was not an agent of justice. He was the cleanup crew for a massacre. "I believe you," he said again. Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days. "Then let me go," she whispered. Jack looked at her. He looked at the fire. The conflict inside him was a physical ache, sharper than his shoulder. "I cannot," he said heavily. "If I let you go, Braddock sends another man, a man who won't share his blanket, a man who will shoot you from 100 yards out. You are a loose end. Clara, they do not want you in jail. They want you dead." Clara's eyes widened. She had not thought of it that way. "So what do we do?" she asked. Jack did not have an answer. The answer came in the form of a rifle shot. Crack. The sound split the night air. A bullet kicked up sparks from the rock inches from Jack's boot. Jack moved on instinct. He did not think, he acted. He threw himself sideways, slamming into Clara and driving her to the ground behind the heavy log they were using as a backrest. "Stay down!" he roared. Another shot whined overhead, thumping into the dirt bank behind them. Then another. Jack scrambled to his knees, peering over the log. 2 muzzle flashes bloomed in the darkness from the ridge above them. They were pinned. The firelight made them perfect targets. Jack grabbed the water bucket and kicked it over the fire. Darkness slammed down on the ravine, leaving only the smell of wet ash and the ringing in their ears. "Here," Jack hissed. He pulled a knife from his boot and slashed the leather thong binding Clara's wrists. "Can you shoot?" he asked. Clara rubbed her wrists. "Yes." He pulled his backup revolver from his saddlebag, a smaller caliber weapon, and shoved it into her hand. "Keep your head down. If they come down the slope, shoot anything that isn't me." Jack moved. He scuttled away from the log, melting into the shadows of the brush. He moved with the silent, deadly grace of the scout he had once been, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Clara lay pressed into the dirt, gripping the gun. Her heart hammered against the earth. She heard the scrabble of boots on rock. "Where are they?" a voice called out from the darkness. A rough, unfamiliar voice. "I don't see them. He doused the fire. Flush them out." Braddock said no witnesses. The name hung in the cold air. Braddock. Clara's fear turned into a cold, hard knot. They weren't lawmen. They were cleaners. Jack flanked them. He moved up the side of the ravine, circling behind the ridge. He saw the 2 shapes crouched against the skyline. He cocked his revolver. The sound was distinct. "Drop it!" Jack shouted. The men spun around. One of them, a man in a long duster, raised a rifle. Jack fired. The shot hit the man in the chest. He crumpled without a sound, his rifle clattering down the slope. The second man hesitated. He looked at his fallen partner, then at the darkness where Jack was hidden. He fired a wild shot into the brush and turned to run. Jack fired again, but the man was already scrambling over the ridge, disappearing into the night. The sound of a horse galloping away faded into the distance. Jack waited. He listened to the silence returning to the ravine. Then he walked down to the fallen man. He struck a match. The man was dead. He was a stranger, a hired gun with hard eyes and a pockmarked face. Jack frisked him. He found a wad of cash, more than a month's wages, and a folded piece of paper in his vest pocket. Jack read it by the dying flare of the match. "Rourke is taking too long. Find them. Silence the girl. If Rourke gets in the way, put him down too. The judge will sign off on it as a mishap." The match burned down to Jack's fingertips. He dropped it. He felt a cold rage settle in his stomach. It was the old humiliation, the feeling of being a pawn in a rich man's game. He had been hired not to bring a criminal to justice, but to deliver a victim to an executioner. And now, he was a target too. He walked back down to the ravine floor. "Clara," he called softly. "I am here." She was crouching behind the log. The gun pointed at the darkness. She was shaking so hard the barrel was vibrating. "It is over," Jack said, holstering his weapon. One dead, one ran. He knelt beside her. Clara lowered the gun. Her hands were trembling so violently she couldn't hold it anymore. It slipped from her fingers and thudded into the dirt. She looked up at him. Her eyes were huge, shining with terror in the gloom. "They were going to kill us," she whispered. "Yes," Jack said. He reached out and took her hands. His fingers were rough, calloused and warm. He covered her cold, shaking hands with his own, pressing them together to stop the tremors. Clara looked at their joined hands. The intimacy of the touch was shocking. It was not the touch of a captor. It was an anchor. Jack looked at her face. The moonlight was filtering through the clouds now, illuminating the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the depth of her fear. "You were right," Jack said, his voice low and gritty. "The law isn't coming for you. Clara, Braddock is—" Clara squeezed his hands. It was a reflex, a desperate need to hold on to something solid. "Thank you," she breathed. "You saved me." Jack shook his head. "I just kept myself from getting shot, but we are in this together now." They left the mountains the next morning, but they did not head for the main road. Jack led them east, into the Badlands, a harsh, broken country of red rock, scrub cedar, and alkali dust. It was a place where tracks disappeared and water was scarce. For 3 days, they moved like ghosts. The landscape was unforgiving. The sun beat down with a relentless, hammering heat during the day, baking the moisture from their skin. At night, the temperature plummeted, freezing the sweat on their backs. Thorns tore at their clothes. Dust coated every inch of their skin. They drank tepid water from canteens and ate sparingly. But the hardship began to erode the walls between them. They rode side by side now. They talked to keep the silence at bay. Clara spoke of her childhood. She told him about the way the townspeople looked at her mother, the washerwoman. She told him about the shame of wearing other people's cast-off clothes, and how Eli was the first person to ever look at her and see a queen. "I was always less than," she said, wiping dust from her forehead. "To them, I was just something that took up space. Eli made me feel like I had a right to be there, like the ground under my feet was mine because I worked it." Jack listened, his eyes scanning the horizon. He told her about the war. He told her about the things he had done for money since, tracking deserters, returning stolen horses, bringing in men who had stolen bread to feed their families. "I am a tool. Clara," he admitted one evening as they chewed on tough jerky, "I am a hammer. You pay me, and I hit the nail. I never asked if the nail deserved it. It was easier not to ask." "It is not too late to stop being a hammer," Clara said quietly. Jack looked at her. Her face was dirty, her hair a mess, but she sat tall in the saddle. She was stronger than any soldier he had ever served with. On the 4th evening, they found shelter under a rocky overhang, a shallow cave carved into the side of a sandstone bluff. It offered protection from the wind and a vantage point over the desert floor. They were exhausted. The adrenaline of the ambush had faded, leaving a deep, hollow fatigue. They sat close together against the rock wall. The space was cramped. Their shoulders touched. They breathed the same pocket of air, smelling of sage, sweat, and dust. Jack checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder. The rhythmic click-click-click was the only sound. Clara watched his hands, strong hands, hands that had killed men, but had also held her back from the cliff edge. "Jack," she said. He looked up. Her eyes were dark and intense. "If you believe me," she said, her voice steady, "if you know Braddock is behind this, why are you still taking me in?" Jack stopped spinning the gun. He looked out at the darkening desert. "Because I do not know who I am if I don't," he said honestly. "I am the man who finishes the job. That is all I have left. If I break the contract, if I become the outlaw, then everything I have done for the last 10 years means nothing." Clara turned her body toward him. Her anger flared, hot and sudden. "So my life is the price of your pride?" she demanded. "You will let them hang me just so you can sleep at night knowing you followed the rules?" "It is not about pride," Jack snapped, his own voice rising. "It is about order. Without the code, I am just a killer." "You are already a killer," Clara cried. "We both are. But at least I killed to save what was mine. You kill for money." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Clara's anger crumbled into pain. Tears welled in her eyes, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "I am so tired." "Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I am tired of men owning my fate, my father, the town, Burke, Braddock. And now you hold my life in your hands like it is a coin you can spend. I am a person. I am alive. She leaned her head back against the rock, closing her eyes, the tears flowing freely now. Jack looked at her. He saw the curve of her throat. He saw the pulse of her life. He felt the immense weight of her words crushing his defenses. He realized she was right. He had been hiding behind his code to avoid facing his own emptiness. He reached out. This time, he did not hesitate. He cupped her face in his hand. His thumb brushed away the tear at the corner of her eye. The skin was soft, warm, and alive. Clara's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him. Startled, she did not pull away. Jack leaned in. His movement was slow. A question asking for an answer. Clara's breath hitched. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the longing that he had kept locked away behind iron bars. Their faces drew closer. Their breath mingled, warm and intimate in the cold air. Both of them were trembling, not from cold, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming desire to bridge the gap between them. Jack closed the distance. His lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce, hungry, and desperate. It tasted of salt and grief. It was a collision of two souls who had been running for too long. Clara grabbed the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with all the pent-up rage and passion inside her. For a moment, the world outside the cave ceased to exist. There was no Braddock, no warrant, no hanging. There was only the heat of his mouth, the scratch of his beard, the desperate affirmation that they were still alive. Jack wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her against him. He felt the fragility of her body and the strength of her spirit. He felt a fierce protectiveness that shattered his professional reserve once and for all. They clung to each other, the kiss deepening, becoming a plea and a promise. Then, slowly, they broke apart. They rested their foreheads together, breathing heavily. Their eyes were closed. The silence returned, but it was charged now, heavy with the weight of what they had just done. Jack opened his eyes. He looked at Clara. Her lips were swollen, her eyes wide and searching. He knew, with a terrifying clarity, that he could not turn her in. He could not trade this woman for $500. He pulled back, putting a few inches of space between them. The loss of contact was a physical ache. "We cannot go back to Dry Creek," Jack said, his voice raspy. Clara watched him, her chest heaving. "Where do we go?" Jack looked at the horizon, where the first stars were appearing. "Red Bluff," he said. "It is a 3-day ride. It is a bigger town. There is a district court there. A federal judge sits circuit next week." Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "A judge?" Jack nodded. "If we go to Red Bluff, we can find the records. We can find a lawyer who isn't in Braddock's pocket. We can fight this, not with guns, but with the truth." He looked at her intensely. "It is a risk. If we fail, we both hang." Clara looked at him. She saw the man who had caught her on the cliff. She saw the man who had shielded her from bullets. And she saw the man who had just kissed her like she was the only woman on earth. She felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. "I'm done running." "Jack," she said softly, "let us go to Red Bluff." Jack nodded. He reached out and took her hand again, threading his fingers through hers. "We leave at dawn." They sat there in the darkness, hands clasped, watching the night settle over the Badlands. The road ahead was dangerous, and the outcome was uncertain. But for the first time, neither of them was facing it alone. The journey to Red Bluff took them through a country that looked as if it had been chewed up and spat out by a giant, iron-toothed beast. They left the clean, cold austerity of the Badlands and entered the mining district, a region where the earth itself bore the scars of men's appetites. The hills here had been stripped of timber to feed the smelters, leaving them bald and gray, eroding into the valleys with every rain. The streams ran thick and brown, choked with silt and poisoned with the quicksilver used to leach gold from rock. Abandoned shacks dotted the hillsides, their windows staring out like empty eye sockets, monuments to dreams that had busted and died. Jack rode in silence, his eyes scanning the ridgelines out of habit, though his thoughts were turned inward. Clara rode beside him, her face wrapped in a scarf against the dust that hung in the air, a permanent, metallic tasting fog. They passed a family on the road, their entire life piled into a single, sway-backed wagon with a broken wheel. A man in patched overalls was trying to lever the axle up with a fence post, while a woman with hollow cheeks held a baby that was too quiet. Jack slowed his horse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 of the silver dollars he had taken from the dead gunman in the ravine. He tossed them to the man without a word. The man looked at the coins in the dust, then up at Jack, his eyes dull with exhaustion. "Thank you, stranger," he croaked. Jack just nodded and spurred his horse on. Further down the road, they saw a group of Shoshone, a family of 5, walking single file along the ditch. They carried baskets and blankets, their heads down, pushed off their hunting grounds by the expanding claim stakes. Clara watched them pass, feeling a strange, aching kinship. They were all debris in the wake of the same machine, the railroad, the mines, the cattle barons. It was a machine that turned land into money and people into dust. Red Bluff appeared on the horizon like a smudge of charcoal against the sky. It was a boomtown that had solidified into a regional hub, a sprawling grid of brick and timber that smelled of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and money. They entered the town cautiously. Jack pulled his hat low. Clara felt exposed, her borrowed coat dusty and worn, her boots scuffed. "We need information before we find a judge," Jack said quietly as they navigated the crowded streets. "We need to tie Braddock to the railroad. The papers you took are a start, but we need the chain of command." They tied their horses at a livery on the edge of town, paying the hostler extra to keep them saddled and ready. Jack led Clara to the railway freight office. It was a chaotic room filled with shouting men and the clatter of telegraph keys. Jack identified a clerk, a young man with ink-stained cuffs and a nervous tick in his left eye, and cornered him near the loading dock. Jack didn't draw his gun. He simply leaned in close, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise. "I am looking for correspondence regarding the Dry Creek Spur," Jack said. "Specifically, letters from a Mr. Silas Braddock to the surveying office." The clerk blinked, sweating. "That is private company business. Mr. I cannot just show you." Jack slid a $10 gold piece across the barrelhead they were using as a table. It was the last of his own money. "I do not want the originals," Jack said. "I just want you to copy the dates in the instructions, particularly anything about land acquisition." The clerk looked at the gold, then at the scar on Jack's forehead. He swallowed hard. "Come back in an hour." When they returned, the clerk handed Jack a folded piece of paper, his hands shaking. "You did not get this from me," the clerk whispered. "They talk about clearing problem elements. They talk about buying the local law." Jack read the paper. It was damning. It listed payments made to Sheriff Burke for security services on dates that matched the harassment of the homesteaders. It linked the railroad's expansion directly to Braddock's land grabs. "We have him," Jack muttered. Clara did not feel the triumph she expected. She felt a heavy, crushing weight. She looked around the bustling street. Women in silk dresses walked past on the arms of men in fine suits. They glanced at Clara with open disdain, their eyes lingering on her matted hair and the dust on her hem. She heard a whisper as 2 women passed. "Look at that trash," one murmured, "probably a camp follower." Clara shrank inside her coat. She realized that to this town, she was not a victim. She was not a widow fighting for justice. She was just a poor, dirty woman who did not belong. The world was quick to believe the worst of her because she had no money to buy its respect. Jack saw her flinch. He moved closer, placing his body between her and the street, shielding her. "Ignore them," he said softly. "They see clothes. I see the woman who walked through a blizzard. They found a lawyer's office near the courthouse. The sign read, Elias Thorne, Attorney at Law." The office was small and dusty, filled with stacks of books that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. Thorne was an older man with a stained vest and eyes that were sharp despite the whiskey on his breath. He listened to Jack's story without interrupting. He looked at the papers from Burke's desk. He looked at the notes from the railway clerk. He leaned back in his chair, tenting his fingers. "You have a case," Thorne said, his voice raspy. "A strong one. This proves conspiracy. It proves the trial was a sham. Can you get it before a judge?" Jack asked. Thorne nodded slowly. "Judge Calloway is riding circuit. He is in town tomorrow. He is a hard man, but he hates corruption. If you can get this evidence to him, he will listen. But what?" Clara asked. Thorne looked at them over his spectacles. "Silas Braddock has friends in Red Bluff, powerful friends. If he knows you are here, you will never make it to the courthouse steps." Jack nodded grimly. "We know." They left the office as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the street. The town felt different now. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Every glance felt like a threat. They checked into a cheap rooming house near the river, avoiding the main hotels where Braddock's men would look first. But as they walked up the stairs, Clara froze. Through the window at the end of the hall, she saw a horse tied at the rail across the street. It was a roan gelding with a white blaze. "That horse," she whispered, grabbing Jack's arm. "That is the horse the foreman rides. Braddock's foreman." Jack looked. He saw a man leaning against a post, smoking a cigarette, watching the door of the rooming house. "We are burned," Jack said instantly. "Back down," quietly. They slipped out the back door into the alley. They moved through the darkening streets, keeping to the shadows. They found another place, a boarding house in the warehouse district, a place that catered to transient laborers. They took a room in the attic. It was tiny, with a sloping roof that forced Jack to stoop. It smelled of damp wool and old lavender. There was a single narrow bed and a small window that looked out over the rooftops. They barricaded the door with the only chair. Jack sat on the edge of the bed, checking his revolver for the third time that hour. Clara stood by the window, peering through a crack in the curtain. The tension in the room was suffocating. They were trapped in a box, waiting for the hammer to fall. Clara turned from the window. Her hands were trembling. "They are going to kill us, aren't they?" she said. Her voice was small in the quiet room. "Even if we have the proof, people do not care about the truth. They care about what they are told. To them, I am just the widow who shot a sheriff." Jack set the gun down. He looked at her. "You are more than that," he said. Clara shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "Am I? Look at me, Jack. I am dirty. I am exhausted. I have killed a man. Maybe I am exactly what they say I am." Jack stood up. He crossed the small space in 2 strides. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm. "Listen to me," he said fiercely. "You are the bravest person I have ever known. You stood up when everyone else knelt down. You are not a killer. Clara, you are a survivor." Clara looked up at him. She saw the intensity in his eyes, the raw honesty. "I am scared. Jack," she whispered. "I am so scared. I am scared too," Jack admitted. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I am scared that I will fail you. I am scared that I will be the man who let another innocent person die because I wasn't fast enough or smart enough. I have carried that ghost for 15 years. I cannot carry another one. Not yours." The confession hung between them. It was the final barrier crumbling. Clara reached up and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the roughness of his beard. "You won't fail me," she said. "You are here." The touch ignited something that had been smoldering since the mountain cabin. The fear, the adrenaline, the proximity. It all coalesced into a desperate, overwhelming need. Jack made a sound in his throat, a low groan of surrender. He pulled her to him. This time, the kiss was not hesitant. It was urgent. It was a collision. They clung to each other as if the floor were falling away beneath them. Jack's hands tangled in her hair, Clara's arms wrapped tight around his neck, pulling him down. They stumbled backward toward the narrow bed. The lovemaking that followed was not gentle. It was frantic and fierce, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. They touched each other with a reverence that bordered on worship, mapping the scars and the hollows, trying to memorize the feel of the other in case there was no tomorrow. Jack whispered her name against her skin. A prayer and a vow. Clara held him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. Later, they lay tangled together under the thin quilt. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor. Jack held her against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. He stroked her hair with a rhythmic, soothing motion. Clara listened to his heartbeat. It was slow and steady now. She felt a sense of peace she had not known was possible. She felt seen. She felt chosen. "We're going to make it," Jack whispered into the dark. Clara closed her eyes. She did not know if he was right, but she knew that whatever happened, she was no longer alone. Morning came with a gray, steel light. They dressed in silence. There was a new weight in the room, a gravity born of the night before. They were no longer bounty hunter and quarry. They were partners. They were lovers. And that made the danger outside sharp enough to cut. Jack checked his weapons. He loaded every chamber. He checked Clara's small revolver and handed it to her. "Keep this in your pocket," he said. "Do not hesitate." They left the boarding house and headed for the courthouse. The town was waking up. Shopkeepers were sweeping the boardwalks. Wagons were rattling down the street. But as they neared the town square, Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was too quiet near the courthouse. The square was dusty and open. The courthouse itself was a brick building with white columns, looking imposing and judgmental. Standing on the steps was a man with a tin star on his chest, Marshal Hatcher. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid his mouth and eyes that shifted too much. "Jack Rourke," Hatcher called out. "Stepping down to the street level, I heard you were in town." Jack stopped. He put his hand on Clara's arm, halting her. "Marshal," Jack said, his voice level, "I have a prisoner to surrender, and evidence to present to Judge Calloway." Hatcher smiled, but his hand drifted toward his gun belt. "Of course. The judge is inside. You just bring the little lady over here, and we will get everything sorted out. Just sign the papers, and you can collect your reward." Jack scanned the square. He saw a movement on the roof of the general store across the street. He saw two men lounging by the water trough, their coats unbuttoned. He saw the way Hatcher was angling his body, trying to clear the line of fire. It was a kill box. Jack's instincts screamed. "Get back!" Jack shouted, shoving Clara hard toward the cover of a parked wagon. As he moved, the square exploded. A rifle shot cracked from the roof. The bullet tore into the dirt inches from where Clara had been standing. Hatcher drew his gun. The two men by the trough pulled pistols. Jack drew and fired in one fluid motion. His first shot hit Hatcher in the shoulder, spinning the marshal around. "Run! Clara!" Jack roared, firing at the men by the trough. Clara scrambled behind the heavy wood of the wagon wheels. Dust and wood chips exploded around her as bullets slammed into the wagon box. Jack was in the open, trading fire. He dropped one of the deputies by the trough, but he was exposed to the riflemen on the roof. He turned to run for cover, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. A rifle bullet caught him in the side, just above the hip. The impact was brutal. It knocked him off his feet, spinning him into the dust. He landed hard, gasping, his gun flying from his hand. "Jack!" Clara screamed. Jack tried to push himself up, but his leg wouldn't work. Blood was already soaking through his shirt, dark and wet. He looked at Clara, his face gray with shock. "Go!" he wheezed. "Get out of here!" Clara looked at the alleyway behind the wagon. It was open. She could run. She could disappear into the maze of streets. She could survive. Then she looked at Jack. He was on his knees, one hand pressing against his side, the other reaching for his dropped gun. The remaining deputy by the trough was taking aim at him. The rifleman on the roof was cycling his bolt. He was going to die. He was going to die because he had tried to save her. The fear that had ruled Clara's life, the fear of power, the fear of men, the fear of death, suddenly vanished. It was replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. She did not run. She lunged from behind the wagon. She didn't run away. She ran toward him. She dove into the dust, sliding next to Jack. She grabbed his heavy Colt revolver from the dirt. It was huge in her hands, heavy and lethal. She rolled onto her back, propping the barrel on her raised knee, and fired. The shot was deafening. The recoil jarred her arm to the shoulder. The deputy by the trough yelled and ducked as the bullet took a chunk out of the wood post next to his head. Clara cocked the hammer and fired again, and again. She laid down a wall of lead, forcing the rifleman on the roof to scramble back behind the parapet. "Get up!" Clara screamed at Jack, grabbing his collar with her free hand. "Get up! Jack!" Jack groaned, grit his teeth, and forced himself to his feet. He leaned heavily on her. She took his weight, her small frame straining, her boots digging into the dirt. They staggered toward the alleyway. Bullets kicked up dust at their heels. Clara fired blindly behind them, keeping the heads of their attackers down. They crashed into the alley, stumbling over trash and crates. "Keep moving," Clara panted. "Do not stop." She dragged him deeper into the labyrinth of red bluff. Jack was stumbling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was losing blood fast. His face was the color of old parchment. "Here," Clara gasped. She saw a back door with a small sign. "Dr. Calloway. Deliveries." She kicked the door. It was locked. She kicked it again, harder, screaming for help. The door opened. An older man with white hair and a startled expression stood there. He saw the gun in Clara's hand. He saw the blood pouring down Jack's side. "Help us," Clara pleaded. "Please." The doctor hesitated for only a second, then stepped back. "Bring him in, quickly." They dragged Jack into the back room and hoisted him onto a leather examination table. Jack groaned, his eyes rolling back in his head. The doctor cut away Jack's shirt. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole in his side, oozing dark blood. "Is he—" Clara couldn't finish the sentence. The doctor pressed a compress against the wound. "He has lost a lot of blood. The bullet is still in there. I need to operate. Now!" Clara stood by the table. She grabbed Jack's hand. It was cold and clammy. "Jack," she whispered, "stay with me. Do you hear me? You do not get to leave me. Not now." Jack's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused. "Run!" "Clara," he whispered. "They will come." "No," Clara said, her voice shaking but fierce. "I am not running. Not anymore." She squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. "You made me love you, Jack Rourke. You do not get to die on me now." She leaned down and kissed his forehead. It was cold and slick with sweat. She straightened up and turned to the doctor. "Save him," she commanded. "Do whatever you have to do." She walked to the door of the examination room. She checked the cylinder of the Colt. 2 shots left. She reloaded it from the loops on Jack's gun belt, her fingers moving with a terrifying calm. "Where are you going?" the doctor asked, reaching for a scalpel. Clara turned. Her face was set in stone. "I am going to find Elias Thorne," she said. The doctor paused. "The lawyer?" "Yes. Tell him to bring the judge here. Tell him we are done hiding." "But Braddock's men," the doctor started. "Let them come," Clara said. She looked at Jack one last time. "We are going to finish this," she said, "right here." She holstered the gun and stood by the door, a sentinel in a blood-stained dress, waiting for the storm to break. The days that followed in the back room of a Dr. Calloway's office were a blur of fever and shadows. Jack Rourke lay on the narrow cot, his body fighting the infection that threatened to take hold in the torn flesh of his side. The bullet had passed through, missing the gut but shattering a rib and tearing muscle. Clara Mallory became his world. She was there when he woke, her face pale and drawn in the lamplight, wiping his forehead with a cool rag. She was there when he drifted into the delirium of fever, muttering names from the war, names of men long dead. She held his hand, anchoring him to the living world with a grip that was surprisingly strong. She fed him broth, spoon by spoon, blowing on it to cool it. She changed the bandages, her face set in a mask of concentration as she cleaned the angry, red wound. She did not flinch at the blood or the smell of sickness. She treated his body with a reverence and a practicality that humbled him. In the quiet hours of the night, when the town of Red Bluff settled into an uneasy silence. They talked. The barriers that had existed between them, the hunter and the hunted, the man and the woman, had been burned away by the desert sun and the gunpowder of the ambush. "I never thought much about tomorrow," Jack whispered one night, his voice rasping in his dry throat. "I figured I would die in a ditch somewhere, or in a cheap rooming house." Clara sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, her hand resting on his arm. "You are not going to die in a ditch," she said firmly. Jack looked at the ceiling, where a water stain looked like a map of a foreign country. "I think about a place sometimes, up near the Tetons. There is a valley where the grass is waist high. A man could build a cabin there, run a few head of cattle, no fences, no barrens, just quiet. It sounds lonely," Clara said softly. "It was," Jack admitted. He turned his head to look at her. "It does not sound lonely anymore." Clara's heart squeezed. She thought of her own dreams, the ones she had buried with Eli. A home, a place where she did not have to look over her shoulder, a place where the land belonged to her, not because a piece of paper said so, but because she knew the soil. "I want a porch," she said. "I want a porch where I can sit and watch the sun go down without being afraid of who is riding up the road." Jack moved his hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "I can build a porch," he said. Their hands clasped, fingers interlacing. It was a promise made in the dark, fragile as a spiderweb but strong enough to hold them both. Outside the doctor's office, the town of Red Bluff was a cauldron coming to a boil. The story of the gunfight in the square had spread like wildfire. The narrative was shifting, twisting with every retelling in the saloons and the mercantile. Some called Clara a witch, a cold-blooded killer who seduced a bounty hunter and turned him against his own kind. They whispered that she was dangerous, that a woman who shot a sheriff would shoot anyone who looked at her wrong. But others, mostly the miners who had been cheated on their wages, and the small ranchers who had been squeezed by men like Braddock, told a different story. They spoke of the ambush. They spoke of the way the marshal had tried to kill Jack Rourke in the street. They whispered that maybe, just maybe, the widow had been right all along. Elias Thorne, the lawyer with the whiskey-stained vest, worked tirelessly. He took the papers Clara had stolen to the circuit judge, Judge Calloway. He argued. He cajoled. He called in favors owed from 20 years of practice. The judge was a stern man, known for a rigid adherence to procedure, but he had a deep hatred for the kind of chaotic corruption that made his court look like a circus. He agreed to hear the evidence. He agreed to review the conviction of Eli Mallory. But Silas Braddock was not idle. He knew his empire was cracking. He filled the town with his riders. They stood on street corners, hands on their guns, staring down anyone who spoke too loudly about justice. They packed the saloons, buying drinks and spreading fear. The day of the hearing arrived 2 weeks after the shooting. The sky was an unforgiving, hard blue, and the heat pressed down on the town like a physical weight. Clara dressed in a clean, simple calico dress the doctor's housekeeper had found for her. She washed her hair and tied it back severely. She looked in the mirror and saw the lines of strain around her eyes, but she also saw a steel in her jaw that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Jack insisted on walking. He refused the crutch the doctor offered. He leaned heavily on a cane, his face pale, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead with the effort of every step. "I am walking in with you," he said, gritting his teeth as he pulled his boots on. "On my feet." They walked to the courthouse together. The street was lined with people. Silence rippled through the crowd as they passed. Men took off their hats. Women stopped their gossiping. Clara walked with her back straight, her chin up. She felt the weight of their stares, the curiosity, the judgment, the hate. But she also felt Jack beside her, his heavy, limping gait matching hers step for step. His presence was a declaration. He was the hunter who had chosen the prey. He was the hired gun who had turned on the master. By standing with her, he was burning his reputation to ash, and he did it without looking back. The courtroom was packed. Every bench was full. Men stood along the back walls, sweating in their wool coats. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco, dust, and tension. Silas Braddock sat in the front row, surrounded by his lawyers and his foreman. He looked impeccable in a gray suit, but his eyes were darting around the room, brittle and angry. Judge Calloway banged his gavel, the sound cracking like a pistol shot in the heavy air. "This court is in session," he boomed. The proceedings were tense from the first moment. Braddock's lawyer, a slick man from Denver with a voice like oil, tried to dismantle them. He painted Clara as a hysterical, vengeful harlot. He painted Eli as a violent malcontent who had threatened a railroad surveyor. He painted Jack as a traitor who had been seduced into dereliction of duty. But then it was Jack's turn. He took the stand, moving slowly, his hand gripping the rail of the witness box until his knuckles were white. "State your name and profession," the bailiff said. "Jack Rourke," Jack said, his voice gravelly but clear. "Former scout, 3rd Cavalry." "Bounty hunter." He looked at the jury, then at the judge. He did not look at Braddock. "I was hired by Silas Braddock to track and capture Clara Mallory," Jack began. "I was told she was a cold-blooded killer. I was told the hanging of her husband was a lawful execution." He paused, shifting his weight to ease the pain in his side. "I found out that was a lie. I found out that Braddock's men ambushed us in the mountains with orders to kill us both. I found correspondence, which has been entered into evidence, that proves a conspiracy to seize the Mallory land by force and fraud." He looked directly at the judge. "I have tracked bad men all my life. Your Honor, I know the look of a killer. Clara Mallory is not a killer. She is a woman who was pushed until she had no ground left to stand on." The courtroom murmured. Braddock's lawyer leaped up, shouting objections, but the judge waved him down. Then Clara took the stand. She sat with her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. She looked small in the large wooden chair. "Mrs. Mallory," Thorne asked gently, "did you shoot Sheriff Burke?" Clara took a breath. "Yeah, I did." The room erupted in whispers. "Why?" Thorne asked. Clara looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the shopkeeper who had turned away when Eli was dragged through the street. She saw the women who had called her trash. "I went to his office to ask him why my husband had to die," Clara said. Her voice shook at first, but then it steadied, becoming clear and resonant. "I wanted to know why the law, which is supposed to protect us, was used to murder a good man." She looked at Braddock. Sheriff Burke laughed at me. He was counting money on his desk. Money from him. She pointed a shaking finger at Braddock. "He told me Eli was a fool. He told me I was nothing. And when he reached for his gun, I knew he was going to kill me just like he killed Eli." She turned back to the judge. "I did not go there to kill him, but I was not going to let him kill me." The silence in the room was absolute. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The evidence was presented. The letters Jack had bribed the clerk for, the deeds Clara had stolen. The testimony of the storekeeper who finally found his courage and admitted he had seen Braddock's men planting the gun on Eli's land. It became a picture that the judge, for all his skepticism, could not ignore. It was a picture of a town eaten alive by greed, where the law had been bought and paid for. Braddock saw it happening. He saw the way the jurymen were looking at him, not with fear anymore, but with disgust. He saw the way the townsfolk were nodding as the evidence piled up. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. "This is a farce," Braddock shouted, his face red. "I will not sit here and be slandered by a whore and a traitor." He signaled to his men. "We are leaving. Sit down. Mr. Braddock," the judge roared. "I am done with this court." Braddock yelled. He turned to the aisle, his hand dropping to the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. His men, 4 of them in the front row, stood up, hands on their weapons, but the aisle was blocked. The townspeople, miners, farmers, shopkeepers, did not move aside. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a human wall. Years of resentment, years of being bullied and cheated, had finally cracked the surface. "Get out of the way," one of Braddock's gunmen snarled. "No," a large blacksmith said, crossing his massive arms. "You sit down." Panic flickered in Braddock's eyes. He pushed the blacksmith. The blacksmith shoved back. The violence erupted in a split second. "Gun!" someone screamed. Braddock's men drew their weapons. The crowd scrambled, screaming, diving under benches. Jack was moving before the first shot was fired. He vaulted the railing of the witness box, ignoring the agony in his side. "Get down! Clara!" he roared. The fight spilled out of the courtroom doors and onto the wide stone steps and the dusty street outside. It was chaos. Braddock and his men were trying to fight their way to their horses. Jack limped onto the portico, snapping a shot that took a gunman in the leg. A bullet chipped the stone column next to his head, spraying him with dust. Townsfolk who had brought hidden weapons pulled them out. It was a riot of suppressed rage. Jack saw Braddock making a run for a horse tied at the rail. The cattle baron was firing wildly over his shoulder. Not caring who he hit, Jack tried to aim, but his injury made his hand unsteady. He couldn't get a clean line of sight. Suddenly, a rifle barrel appeared on the railing beside him. Clara held the Winchester she had grabbed from a fallen deputy. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but her hands were steady. She did not look at Jack. She looked at the man who had ordered her husband's death. She fired. The shot caught Braddock in the thigh. He screamed, his leg buckling under him, and he crashed into the dust of the street. His gun flew from his hand. Braddock's men, seeing their boss down and facing a town that had suddenly found its teeth, threw down their weapons. It was over. The smoke drifted lazily in the hot air. Glass crunched underfoot. Groans of the wounded rose from the street. Jack lowered his gun. He looked at Clara. She lowered the rifle, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. Judge Calloway walked out onto the steps. He looked at the carnage. He looked at Braddock writhing in the dirt, surrounded by the angry townspeople. He smoothed his robes. "Bring the prisoner back inside," the judge ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. "And get a doctor for the wounded. We are going to finish this properly." The verdict, when it came an hour later, was not perfect justice, but it was justice. The judge declared the conviction of Eli Mallory to be vacated, citing gross procedural misconduct and fraud. He ordered a federal investigation into Silas Braddock's business dealings. As for Clara, the judge looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Mallory, you killed a lawman. In the eyes of the statute, that is a crime. However, the evidence suggests you acted under extreme duress and provocation, in fear for your life, against an officer who had abandoned his duty to the law." He banged the gavel. "I am ruling this a justifiable homicide in self-defense. You are free to go." A murmur went through the room. It was a mix of shock and relief. But as Clara walked out of the courthouse, free of chains, she felt the weight of the eyes on her. Some people nodded to her, a sign of respect, but others, the church ladies, the men who believed in order above all else, looked at her with coldness. She heard the muttering, "Still a killer. Dangerous woman. Trouble follows her." She realized then that a verdict could clear her name, but it could not wash away the blood or the reputation. To this town, she would always be the woman who shot the sheriff, and Jack would always be the man who turned. Jack met her at the bottom of the steps. He had his arm in a sling now, his face gray with exhaustion. He put his good arm around her back. It was not a possessive gesture. It was a steadying one, a silent vow. "We cannot stay here," Clara said quietly, not looking at the crowd. "I know," Jack said. They packed their few belongings that night. The doctor refused to take payment, pressing a bag of supplies into Clara's hands instead. "Take care of him," the doctor said, "and take care of yourself, girl. You have earned a life." They left at dawn. The sky was a pale, washed-out lavender. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The town of Red Bluff was asleep, its windows dark and blind. They rode out slowly, Jack on his gelding, Clara on a new horse the lawyer had arranged for her. They did not look back. There was no parade, no applause, just the rhythmic clop of hooves on the hard-packed earth. They rode until the town was just a smear of charcoal on the horizon behind them. They climbed a ridge that overlooked a valley to the north. It was the start of the high country, where the air was thin and clean. They stopped the horses. Jack looked out at the land. It was vast, rugged, and indifferent. It was a hard place. But down in the valley, there was a ribbon of green where a crooked stream cut through the rock. The grass looked tough, but it was there. That looks like a place, Jack said, pointing with his chin. Clara followed his gaze. She saw the isolation. She saw the work it would take, the rocks to be cleared, the fences to be built, the winters to be survived. But she also saw the horizon. It was wide enough to breathe, wide enough for second chances. "It looks like home," she said. Jack turned to her. The morning sun caught the silver in his beard and the scars on his face. He reached out and took her hand. Clara squeezed his fingers. She felt the roughness of his skin, the warmth of his blood. They leaned across the space between the horses. They kissed. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the cave, born of the fear of death. It was a deep, unhurried kiss. It tasted of coffee and morning air. It carried the weight of everything they had survived. The grief, the injustice, the blood on their hands, the betrayal. But beneath the scars, it carried a fierce, stubborn joy. They pulled apart slowly, their foreheads resting together for a moment. "Ready?" Jack asked softly. Clara sat back in her saddle. She looked at the man who had hunted her, saved her, and loved her. She looked at the vast, terrifying, beautiful country ahead. She smiled. It was a small smile, tired but real. "I am ready." They turned their horses toward the valley. Two small figures against the immense canvas of the west, riding down into the long shadows. Their love a fragile but burning flame against the cold winds of the frontier. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Clara and Jack. It has been a journey across the dusty plains and snow-capped peaks of the American West, exploring themes of justice, survival, and the enduring power of love. I would love to hear from you. Please comment down below and tell me where you are listening from in the world. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West so you never miss an adventure. And finally, I invite you to share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did you think justice was served? What do you think the future holds for Clara and Jack on their new ranch? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.